Oh, hey, what's going on? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, let me make sure I adjust this so you can see me perfectly. What's going on?
Yeah, I can put my headphones in too. Not too much. How's it going?
Super excited to do this conversation. A lot of people have asked me questions about it, so it's a pretty hot topic.
It is. People are really excited about this because I think there's lots of people talking about it,
Hmm.
and a lot of people don't know who to trust. As you could see, I sent you the responses that I got when I asked where do you go to for information, and there's such a variety of sources. So,
Yes. Where do you want to start? Because there's so many different things to cover. And I feel like we can kind of go, I figure we can kind of talk a little bit of, and some of the stuff that you share from like definitions and really understanding the differences of really what fasting is.
mhm.
And then maybe we can even talk about, I know there's a lot of questions that kind of came up as far as like fat loss and whether it's an effective strategy, or is it more effective than other kinds of quote unquote methods.
Mhm.
And then we can even talk about some other claims that exist behind intermittent fasting, such as, for example, I know you had some notes like autophagy, stuff like even that are in performance, and
Mhm.
things of that sort that can also be effective. You want to kind of like put it that way?
Sounds perfect. Yeah.
Awesome. So where do you want to
You
start?
want to introduce yourself just in
Yeah,
case people don't know you?
absolutely. Absolutely. So, let's start from the beginning. So, my name is Andres Ayesta. I'm a registered dietitian, nutrition coach out of Tampa, Florida. Originally from Venezuela, but I've developed a really big passion for advanced nutrition strategies such as intermittent fasting, ketogenic diets. It's not like I push them, but I research them very, very much every single day. And now I kind of teach people how to similarly to you, Alex, like how to basically achieve their goals from the body composition perspective, and through flexible eating. And sometimes I incorporate some methods like intermittent fasting in some of my clients for sure.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that you say that you don't necessarily push it because I think there's a lot of the very well known people that promote intermittent fasting, at least on Instagram and social media. They're very, very dogmatic about that
Yeah,
approach being maybe the best for everyone. And I think I use it with certain clients also, but it's important to know what it is and who it might not be for and who it is for. So that's why I
yeah.
wanted to just give a good overview of it.
Absolutely. So definitions maybe first.
Yeah.
So fasting for people listening to this is not a diet, and people look at it as like a diet, and it's not necessarily like technically by definitions of dieting, like it's essentially kind of creating a specific kind of set of rules within a specific like certain foods or so that you need to consume usually for caloric restrictions for most cases. Intermittent fasting is not necessarily a diet; it's a meal schedule. It's a time restriction that is created depending on different kinds of methods. So sometimes it goes from only 12 hours. According to medical standards, fasting is defined as like this the basically fasting in the body physiologically starts after the sixth meal that you consume. So if you had a piece of bread tonight, just now, like technically 6 hours after, according to medical standards, it's considered fasting. So everybody listening and watching this fast every single day, every single night when you go to sleep. Now there are different kinds of methods, but that's like the main. And I talk really interesting on this topic, and I always tell people fasting is not starvation. It's many different. It's completely different. Starvation is a physiological state. Fasting is something that you do voluntarily. So that's kind of like the main thing that exists. But then what most people understand as intermittent fasting is essentially a time restricted schedule. So you essentially not consume any kind of caloric foods or beverages for a period that sometimes lasts anywhere between 16 like 12 to 16 hours. And there's other kinds of fasting methods that can actually range from 24 to 48 to 72 hours and above. And obviously the way that is described, it really depends on the definition that exists around that. So for example, like time restricted feeding, like I said, it's more what you do on a daily basis. So this is like the typical 16-8 approach, with most people usually hear about like on social media and stuff, which is like most people stop eating around 9 o'clock and they start to eat around 1 p.m. the next day. So it's a 16 hours of like window that you're not consuming anything. And then you start to your feeding window, which starts around 1 o'clock and it ends at 9. Now, what people don't really understand is like that is an arbitrary time frame that you can change if you want to. You can, by all means, like if you want to have breakfast and stop eating at 4 o'clock because it makes sense to you, you can still do that if you wanted to. The problem is like most people usually adhere to this specific type of program is because everybody's social and they have like 9 time, and it's impossible to kind of stick to a intermittent fasting program in times in which you are not basically like when you're out and about and hanging out with people. So but that's kind of like the main definition that exists. Of course, there are many different methods and approaches, and there's different names if you wanted to go over those. But that's kind of like the way I define it, just to start off with.
Yeah. I think most people who are here watching this probably are most curious about the 16-8 method, which is time-restricted feeding. But like you said, there are some people that do like alternate day fasting, or 5-2 is another popular one. So, I think ultimately it's important to ask yourself why you want to try this or why you want to do it. What is the benefit you're looking for? Is it weight loss? Is it digestion? Is it, insulin sensitivity? So that would kind of determine the rules that maybe you set for yourself.
Yeah. And the main one that most people are here for and they want to know is, it's for weight loss or fat loss. And the idea behind intermittent fasting is there's like 2 different schools of thought. Mine is simple, based on research and based on what we know. It's a way to create caloric restriction, straightforward. So when you are cutting out like a good amount of time from the day, let's say that you work on a 9 to 5 job and you wake up at 7 a.m. and you have your breakfast at 7:30, and then you have another snack at 10 o'clock, that's already adding a good 30% of your total calories for the day, especially if you have a large breakfast. When you're cutting that out, then you are creating probably a calorie restriction that did not exist before. So that's technically the way that the fat loss usually happens. That is one school of thought. The second school of thought that exists from research is that there's a claim that when you create an environment in which you like prolong the amount of time where there's no food availability in your body, there's specific adaptations and little like switches that go on and off to try to optimize fat oxidation, which is basically your body's ability to use more fat and produce more what we call like the ketone bodies, which is the byproducts of fat as a result of that time frame. Now, the thing is, like most of the studies that look at some of this stuff, they're looking at fasting that extends beyond 24 hours, not the typical 16 hours. Now, am I here to say that there's no improvements in adaptation and when your body actually uses fat, especially if you do this for a long time? No, I think there's still a lot of research that needs to come out to show some of that stuff. And I do think that there's going to be a benefit to certain people doing so, and that's why I preach it. But all in all, for fat loss, for people that are listening to this, it's just a way to create calorie restriction. Is it the only way? Absolutely not. Can you still achieve the same exact result by not doing intermittent fasting? Yes, if you learn how to create caloric restriction. You know what's like the biggest mistake that most people make when doing intermittent fasting? Is like they completely, the ones that see the results, they go and say, okay, cool, like I am seeing amazing results. Yes, you were eating a lot of calories for breakfast, and now you're cutting a big percentage of that. The ones that don't, that this didn't work out for me, well, maybe they were having like really small amount of calories to start off with, and maybe just like their second part of the day still filled with a lot of calories, and they lack awareness around that. So
or they're making up for it.
Or they're making up for it, which is another big reason. And we're going to talk about binging and some of the people, some of the things that I try to be cautious and I warn some of the different people as far as what they should do or should not do and who this is and this is not for. But that's like the main reason that exists. Now, when you look at the other claims, there's like, you know, some claims as far as like autophagy, which we'll talk about that, in longevity. There's some claims as far as insulin sensitivity, which is basically the way that we describe your body's ability to use carbohydrates effectively and put them in the right places. There's some research also on like, you know, body composition, as we talked about fat loss. There's a lot of different things. But again, like a lot of times people put fasting methods all in this like one big conglomerate, and there's many different things that exist. And the typical one that most people follow, which is the 16-8, there's just still a lot not there's not a lot still data that exists to be able to say and to support very like, you know, strongly some of those claims.
Yeah. Yeah. That's perfectly said. I think like the longevity studies are interesting, but those, and that's not really anything new. People have been using fasting in religion for so long, and a lot of the studies that we have do come from Ramadan.
Yeah.
So, you know, when they're going from sunrise to sunset and they're not eating for periods of time, because it is, like all nutrition research, very hard to get a cohort of people that we can follow for
Yeah.
that for many, many years and have them follow this way of eating. And
Yeah.
so it comes down to also like adherence. I think a problem with a lot of the studies that I've seen were that like half the group wasn't really adherent for
Yeah.
the entire study. So, you know, I think for me personally, I've always been someone who doesn't really care about breakfast. I like to kind of backload my calories later in the day. It just works better for me. But there are other people who that doesn't make sense for.
Yeah. I agree.
But I think actually with that, a question that comes up, even not related to intermittent fasting at all, well, isn't it bad to eat more food later in the day? Shouldn't you be eating it earlier?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it all comes down to what works for you best originally, initially, because like, I'm like you, I prefer to backload a lot of my calories later in the day because it's easier. It depends also on the stage that you're on. But the question always, you know, comes in like, well, what happens? And can I have like a 800 calorie meal or 900 calorie meal, like, especially like, you know, for females at 8 o'clock at nighttime before I'm breaking my fast? According to like, well, technically by standards, if you're a person that is healthy, that don't have any blood sugar issues or anything like that, technically speaking, if you're still achieving a state of calorie restriction, it doesn't really matter if you're actually having, but I do obviously preach important a balance. Like if you have like 1,800 calories to be consuming daily and you're going to leave them all into like a 30-minute window, maybe that's not ideal, because here's like some of the things that a lot of people don't talk about. That is going to disrupt your sleep. If you're having like let's say 1,000-calorie meal, like a steak meal or something like that, because you have a ton of fat, and if you're counting macros or something like this, and you're having it at 9 o'clock and you're going to bed at 10, there's a thermic effect of food that is increasing temperature in your body that may disrupt your sleep.
Night
sweats. And then that is going to lead to a cascade of like different reactions and things like leading up to next day, sleep deprivation. But then nobody's putting that stuff all together. And so that's why it's important to make sure that you kind of establish a really good balance between those meals. And that's why when people do intermittent fasting, I teach them, I said, if you don't know, like if you don't create awareness, for example, as far as like how many calories, macronutrients you're consuming on a daily basis, yeah, some people it's effective and they don't even do that simply because where they were starting is completely different to maybe where you are starting. So that is like a big part of it, and creating awareness around that and understanding how it is, then it kind of helps you balance and do a well-formulated intermittent fasting program. We're going to call this that way. Well-formulated usually we do it for sometimes like ketogenic programs, but then also for like intermittent fasting programs, which is essentially going to help you organize your meals in a very effective strategy.
Yeah.
Like, I implement it with some of my clients on fat loss stages when I lower their calories a lot, but they still love to consume high volumes of foods like you and I. Like I love to sit down and have like this big meal. I don't like to have something small. So I prefer to organize my nutrition in a way that I have a lunch, a dinner, and sometimes like a little dessert that I have at night. So I mean, I organize my calories according to that, which is a good way for creating calorie control and macronutrient control. That's the way I kind of see it from the fat loss perspective.
Yep, I do the same thing. But I do explain to people too, I almost kind of call it like an advanced level of nutrition for people starting out. I think if you don't know how many calories you're eating, if you don't know how you feel best, to skip to intermittent fasting without first kind of doing the work of seeing how to fuel your body, learning how much you're eating, what a good macronutrient ratio is for you, you're jumping ahead a couple steps.
You are. And I think I always teach it on my clients. I don't ever, first of all, with mine, I don't ever push this on the first go. Like, oh, hey, like and some clients come to me because I am that this is the area that I do handle a lot, and they come to me, it's like, oh, I thought we were gonna do intermittent fasting. It's like, hold your horses. Like, you have nothing. You don't even know what carbohydrates and fruits yet. We don't even. We
Mm-hmm.
need to fix your nutrition first, and then we need to start building up into understanding whether maybe that's something that we can do down
You play
far in
around
the
with it.
future. Yeah, I have a
Mm-hmm.
client, for example, he's been with me for 4 months, and we didn't do that at all until like the fourth month, which we started like lowering his calories a lot. And I was like, okay, let's try incorporate some of this, and it worked out phenomenally for him. And
Mm-hmm.
he's a very busy guy, and he's like, I'm loving this, but he has massive control, and he already has the education and the foundation to start off with. What I see most people nowadays, though, is, especially when you did the poll and those questions, that most people, like, the resources that they go for to try to learn about intermittent fasting is the internet. If you type in right now in Google intermittent fasting, there's going to be not only like 5 ads teaching you like how to start an intermittent fasting program, and intermittent fasting 30-day program, or intermittent fasting this and this and that. And it's all selling this idea of like, okay, like we need to start this, like, cut out your breakfast and cut out everything. And some people don't even have any clue as far as like how to organize their nutrition throughout the rest of the day. They just kind of go for that. So
Mm-hmm.
sometimes that doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah. So this is a good question from Lena or Leanna. I hope I'm pronouncing your name the right way. Why do some IF experts say you can have beverages of 50 calories or under, or some other fat-based snacks, but other experts say you can't have anything? So what I posted today, that was
Yeah.
breaking your fast. Of course, I was being facetious, but you'll hear a lot of people. They're like the bulletproof coffee people. Then there are people who are like, you can't have lemon. You can. I think
Yeah.
going into that a little bit to explain why you might hear these different things.
The way I explain it is simple. Like, a true fast by definition is nothing. Like, no calories, no nothing. So technically it's water only. Now, there are modifications to that definition that some people explain it, and it depends on the premise that exists. So for example, from the insulin perspective, some people say that if there's anything that causes an insulin response, then that technically breaks your fast. Now, then there's the bulletproof, fanatics that say, well, fat doesn't really raise your insulin, so we might as well push 600 calories worth of butter and add it into coffee with coconut oil.
Mm-hmm.
I'm fasting. That is not a fast. Like, and that's, you're just adding a very fatty breakfast.
Yeah.
That's really
And
what it comes down
especially
to.
if you're doing this for weight loss,
Yes.
it's about cutting out calories. So why are we
Exactly.
now adding it in through something that you would have never had in the first place? What
Yeah.
I tell people too, I'm like, if you're doing this for weight loss and you want to have a cup of coffee in the morning and you're good until 1, do it, whatever. It's just for weight loss. Like, we're not worried
Yeah.
about insulin or anything, but it comes down to that, blood sugar control, insulin.
Yeah. I do think that there are, so for example, there are certain products, like, specifically to Liana's question about beverages that are 50 calories and under. I do tell people, and I think somebody else also asked a question about like things like sweeteners and monk fruit extract and stevia. Like, honestly, like, we call it a modified fast. It's not
Mm-hmm.
a true fast, but then are those things like affecting your actual, like, let's just put fat loss from the, to the side for a minute, and let's just pretend that there's benefits to like maintaining a full state of fast, from the perspective of maybe fat oxidation, and your body's getting better at like burning fat from that perspective. They just say that was the claim. Then you would want to make sure that you cut out a lot of those different things. Now, coffee or tea, is that something that you can add? Possibly, you can do that. Can you add the sweetener here and there? Sure. But then when you start to add, things like, well, for example, the BCAAs, that's like a typical thing that a lot of people kind of come to me. And there's like 5 to 6 calories because there's like 2 to 3 grams of carbs. From the perspective that I'm mentioning, no, you can't have that. Now, from the perspective of like calorie restriction, yeah, you're having 5 calories into that drink. So there's not a big of a difference that you're going to add. But then it really depends on exactly how you're doing it. So again, like when somebody, like, somebody says in there, intermittent fasting experts, like, it's just like, it's such a gray area, and then everybody's going to give you a different response, but nobody actually tells you like, hey, it depends. You know,
Right.
like it depends. Like it's like there's always kind of like black or white. No, don't do this or do that, otherwise
And
you're not doing the right way.
I would say if they're a true expert, they will say it depends because
Exactly.
there's no study that takes like intermittent fasting with caffeine and no, or with stevia and no caffeine, and like you can't. It's there's so many variables that we have not yet controlled for in a research setting. So
Yeah.
a lot of it's kind of conjecture. Like it seems like this would be what it is, but and also at the end of the day, it's like how big of a difference does it make? The studies even like looking at like lean mass and how much of the weight do people when people are given the same amount of calories, but they're spread through the day, or if they're time restricted.
Yeah.
Some studies show that they lose more lean mass, others show they like lose less. So we're left with kind of, I'm not so sure, at least right now. So if it's something that you feel good with doing and it fits seamlessly into your life.
Yeah. I do agree. And I think like, and also like talking specifically, because the question a lot of people may ask too is this more effective? Like, so the initial question that we had, is it more effective? What is like the most effective calorie restriction method? Is it intermittent fasting, or is it like, well, maybe having like 4 or 5 meals per day that are split up, from breakfast to lunch? They actually did a really interesting study. I think it's a guy named Morrow. And essentially they put 2 groups of people. One of them, they were getting 100% of the calorie needs. So no caloric restriction, actually. They wanted to see what happens if the first group, they would feed them at 1, 4, and 8 o'clock. And the other group, they gave them, again, 100% of their calorie needs. So this means no caloric restriction. And they gave them breakfast at 8 o'clock, 1 o'clock meal, and an 8 o'clock meal. So again, the difference that exists is like there's a group that they have the same 3 meals that they get, but then one group basically they push a fast for about 16 hours. What they found is the gains and like as far as like muscle mass, because they also put them through a training program, there was a slight improvement more in the time restricted feeding group compared to the other one. There was a lot of limitations in the study, but this is where like that part of me says like there may be a benefit when you're actually equating calories and protein. There may be a slight benefit that we're not fully sure of, because here's the thing with intermittent fasting. There's like this master, like I want you to think about this like switch. It's called AMPK. So this AMPK switch is like a master regulator that literally dictates everything that happens to your metabolism. Oh, like we're running low on calories. Let's start like increasing fat oxidation, so we can meet those things. Oh, like we haven't gotten food for this amount of time. Okay, we need to activate certain things. So when the research have actually gone more in depth into understand what happens to that master switch that exists, it appears that whenever you sustain intermittent fasting for a while, there's a positive interaction that occurs in saying, well, maybe your body is becoming more effective at relying on fat as a main source of fuel in scarcity of nutrients, or whenever there is caloric restriction.
Caloric deficit.
So yes, where there's caloric deficit. So that was a really interesting, it was like something different, because again, there's like the people that talk about calories in, calories out, that says like, oh, it's because of the caloric restriction. But we need to look at the other side of the picture too, to really understand exactly what's going on and what happens. And I feel like that's something else that we need to understand too, that there may be a potential for, for some of this stuff and people that do intermittent fasting. Now, I tell people, if you're going to do intermittent fasting and you're going to try to stick to it, just because you want to explore some of these different things, not necessarily because of fat loss, but just simply because you're trying something different, we're going to do this for 3 to 6 months. In fact, when I started my own personal experiments on intermittent fasting, I started doing this I said like, I'm going to do it for 6 months, and I push it for an entire year, where because I'm a guinea pig on myself. So I try to test the different things out on myself, and I try to figure out what happens if I do this, and I push it for like an entire year. And I realized that, for example, my workouts in a fasted state were more effective. So I actually felt better. Now, this is not to say that people, oh yeah, so I need the guy that on the Instagram Live said that if you do fast, like you're going to have better workouts. Absolutely not. But I felt it became more effective. This is completely anecdotal and something that happened to me. So in my mind, maybe because I pushed it for a long time, my body became effective at using fat as a really good source of fuel in times where I was fasting. So I think that there's a lot that needs to come out to really explain some of those different things. Maybe I'm completely wrong, but I'm open to the idea that there may be a slight benefit in doing something like that as well. So something worth noting.
Yeah. And I think it's also important because I do see we have a crossover, but I think I also get a lot of women with, disordered eating, disordered relationship with food, kind of like, have always been looking for a quick fix. I think it's important to know too that if you're underfeeding yourself, if you're chronically under eating, if you're not getting enough fat, if you're not getting enough protein, then all of these benefits that we're talking about go out the window.
Yeah,
I mean, you can't be fat adapted if you are eating, 25 grams of fat per day. So I think you have to kind of prioritize these things too and realize, like, are you truly doing this to be healthy, or are you looking for another way to just restrict calories? And then you're kind of getting ahead of yourself. But
and I think you brought a good point of and now jumping into the people that I would not recommend something like this to, which is going to be those that don't really have a good relationship with food. And this can go anywhere between people that may have binging issues to eating disorder histories and stuff like that, simply because of the fact that a lot of times food becomes, when there's scarce of it, and whenever it becomes available, because you have this magic time where you're supposed to eat, and whenever there's lack of education, people don't understand sometimes that there's a mental aspect to it, and people may just completely lose control at the times that they're breaking their fast. It's but they justify it saying well, I'm fasting for this amount of time. You have to the times that I teach a lot of my clients to fast, and I tell them if at 1 o'clock comes in and you're losing control over the food consumption or the food that you're consuming, that's not a good sign. And I want you to tell me. Now, if you're okay, I'm hungry because I'm just starting this, and it's it's an adaptation process, and then 1 o'clock hits, I'm super hungry, but I control myself because I knew, and I actually felt satisfied with the typical meal that I normally have. Okay, then we're on a good, there's a completely different story. So I don't ever recommend it to somebody that has a kind of history that basically don't necessarily see food as, what it is as fuel, and then they have a really bad relationship with it. And I think that's a group of people that I would say, we may need to try something different as far as that. So
yeah, or at least re-regulate things. So Classy B, NYC, wants to know, so some people fast every day. So some people do every other day. Some people just kind of do it when it works. And I think this question comes down to, again, what are you doing it for? If you're doing it for weight loss, you don't have to, have this set of rules where every day you have to do it from, 9 p.m. to the next day at 1 p.m. If you have a lunch meeting and you have to shift things, it's meant to be a tool to help support your weight loss. And if it's stressing you out, if it's not fitting into your life, then it doesn't make sense. So being able to adapt, I hear people being I see in Facebook groups, they're I can't make it to 1, I'm dying, I feel terrible all morning, what do I do? It's well, why are you doing that? It's not something that you should have to suffer through.
Yeah, and I think and I tell people there's no a textbook a set of rules that needs to exist as far as intermittent fasting. And some people actually go down this path and says, oh, they're gonna invite them. I had a client that says, well, I have a lunch at 12 o'clock. Sorry, I can't go because I can't break my fast until 1. That is straight up BS. I tell my clients do not ever actually miss out on something simply because you're quote unquote breaking your fast.
You're not Gandhi.
Yeah, exactly.
What do you if there are those benefits, we don't know truly about them yet.
Yeah.
For the most part, you're still going to see benefits. You're still going to see the weight loss. If we're talking about a small benefit in, muscle mass or anything like that, if you're missing a day out of your entire life, it's not worth it. Now and you mentioned something important, there's religious reasons, yes, this exists, Ramadan, you said, in some cases, this is not a choice because there's a religious purposes. In fact, fasting has been practiced for centuries, and this is why this is something and I forgot to mention this at the beginning, it's nothing new. This is being recorded in history for thousands of years, and religious purposes is mainly the one that actually they do, and then Ramadan is the one that is more predominant because
technically about 30% of our world's population are actually Muslim. So that's obviously like a big amount of people that are fasting once a month, or not once a month, once a year, for 30 days from like dusk to dawn. So from like the sunset to, or sunrise to sunset. So in those cases, yeah, there are strict rules you have to follow. But for people that are doing it for like caloric restriction purposes and then just to organize their nutrition, that's totally fine. And you don't even need to call it intermittent fasting. You just essentially say you're just like, you're eating
I
on
don't eat
time restricted.
breakfast.
Yeah, I just don't eat breakfast. And that's totally fine. And I think that's something, you know, that people understand. Now there, back to like that question by a classic by NYC, there is a method called alternate day fasting that is being documented in research by Dr. Vardai in Chicago. She does a lot of research on this stuff.
She does like,
yeah, a lot of research on this specific method, which is essentially you eat normally today, and tomorrow you cut down your calories either to 0 or 25% for 24 hours. Yeah. So that's not a whole lot. That's like 500 calories. So you're having just like a one meal and then you're done. Again, you're creating, when you look at 7 days of the week, you're creating a net total calorie deficit, maybe not on a daily basis. And that's where we have to look at the bigger picture. I never played around with that too much. But that there's one, like the most like research done in specific weight loss. It comes from her lab and that specific method that they implement for that purpose. But it's not the typical thing that most people kind of follow. But it's one of the methods that exist out there. ADF. Yeah.
So E. Gertie says, can you elaborate on the adaptation period? So basically, how long could it take for someone to like not feel hungry and kind of get used to it? To what extent should one feel deprived when starting out?
Good question. So just like anything new to your body, it takes some time for it to adjust. One thing that I always also teach my clients is our bodies actually operate on a clock, like a biological clock that it literally tells us, like, you know, this is, for example, like when I was in college, like that clock was like, you know, telling me to go to sleep at 2 o'clock in the morning. Now that clock is telling me like it's time to go to bed at like 9:30 or 10. So the same thing happens with that clock as far as the hunger levels and hunger pangs that you may experience throughout the day. So when you're switching and you're a person that does normally breakfast for like a long time, and now you're cutting that out completely, then what you're going to notice is you're going to see that there is like, at first, in the first week, you're going to notice a big issue in there, because you're going to feel those, you know, those kind of signals of your body saying like, hey, let's see, like you haven't really given me enough food right now, and what's going on? This is not our deal. This is not what we normally do. But then usually in my experience, that's something that after 1 to 2 weeks, if you do it in a very controlled, well-formulated intermittent fasting program, it starts to go away. And a lot of times, like, and this is the other thing that I also tell people, most people, especially if you listen to this, they're chronically not hydrating properly. So, and one of the things too is that a lot of times, like, we confuse hunger with thirst. And in the morning, a lot of times, especially when people are trying to explore intermittent fasting as just something different, again, like, you know, not necessarily just for fat loss purposes, and they realize that, okay, well, if I start to drink more water and I kind of stay a little bit more hydrated throughout the morning, then I feel a little bit better. I actually don't even notice it. But then I tell people listening to this, like, when it's like, think about a time, for example, that you slept in until like 11 o'clock because you went out the night before. You slept until 11 o'clock and you didn't wake up like randomly at 7 o'clock to have breakfast because your hunger actually started. So a lot of times hunger is a psychological trait that sometimes like people don't understand it. And hunger is not starvation. Like, just because you're hungry doesn't mean that your body's starving. And that's why a lot of like differentiator that exists. I teach my clients obviously to say, you know, follow your hunger cues, but at the same time, those can be manipulated. And I tell people hunger comes in waves. And a lot of times when you push long enough, like, think about a time you were so busy working. Like, you know, you and I were, as entrepreneurs, like, think about a time that you were just so busy working on something and you completely forgot that you hadn't eaten in like 6 hours. Same thing. Your mind is not thinking about it. Now, when you wake up in the morning and you're thinking, oh my God, I haven't had any breakfast, then hunger is going to come in, and then it's going to continue to be on your brain and your mind, and obviously that's going to have. So when people, if you're wanting to try this out as a way to, you know, to explore something different, then let the hungers actually come in and out. Like, it's basically waves that come and go, and you've learned how to serve them, then usually you're going to be okay. But usually I tell people about 2 weeks is when you start to feel like, okay, like I feel a little bit better now.
Yeah. And I think like I tell people start with the shorter window, you know, like you
Yeah,
don't have to start off
exactly.
with 16 hours. Start the day, kind of see when you start to get hungry
Yeah,
and like let it happen naturally and kind of
yeah,
go from there.
yeah.
Um,
That's a good strategy too.
so actually speaking of the 16 hours, so there is some research about the length of time for women, like maybe for female hormones having started like have a negative effect with longer fasts. So
Hmm.
that was something that
Yeah,
has been brought up. So I don't know, you know, you have male and female. Do you notice
yeah.
any difference for them either like from adherence perspective or
Yeah, I do. I have consulted with a lot of people about this topic because here's the thing. The female reproductive system is pretty smart. And whenever there is a lack of calories or there's a, severe caloric restriction, the female reproductive system is going to do everything it can to try to not have babies. And it's going to change hormones in one way or another to prevent that. So what I notice the most in people that do intermittent fasting is specifically women is usually this kind of like hormone dysregulations that exist usually happen because the level of caloric restriction that exists is way too high. So
mm-hmm,
these are, for example, women that are now starting intermittent fasting. I have a client that is kind of going through that process, and she started intermittent fasting as a way for fat loss, but she was already caloric, like she was like chronically under eating all the time. Sometimes like when some binging episodes once a week or so like that. So obviously it was kind of like this up and down. But then she went on to now intermittent fasting, so cutting
even more?
the little bitty eating calories that they were consuming for breakfast, and now they're actually consuming less than 1,000 calories a day. Of course your body's going to shut down and it's going to tell like, hey, listen, we're not ready for this, and hormones are going to be all out of whack, and it's usually what causes that. So I
Mm-hmm,
don't think it's inherently the fasting window that creates this kind of response, especially on a daily basis. Maybe a prolonged fast will probably do that, but it's more like the level of caloric restriction that exists, and then this comes down again to not knowing exactly how many calories you're consuming or your
mm-hmm.
macronutrient breakdown within those calories.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, if it's furthering your caloric restriction, I think that that's it's helpful, but there it's also comes there's a certain point like how low is too low. And for women, you know, hypothalamic amenorrhea is something that you'll see
Yeah,
when, you know, with overexercise, chronic undereating, and all this stuff. I think if your energy's tanking, if you're not getting your period, if your libido is low,
yeah.
all of these things are a sign that you have to maybe reevaluate.
Yeah, and so a lot of times increase your calories, and sometimes that comes by either not necessarily doing fasting, which is this example of this
Hmm.
client of mine that I have. I was like, why do we need to do intermittent
Maybe this
fasting?
isn't
Because
the best.
it's what got me the results I wanted. It's like, well, maybe to this point, but now you're actually feeling miserable and not having the energy and having all these different problems. So
Hmm.
why do we need to do it if you're already struggling to have it? Because it's the other part too. There's people that have like really low appetites, like they can't have like bigger portions of foods.
Hmm.
Like this is like, for example, the kind of person that could probably not do intermittent fasting very effectively because
Yeah.
again, they're failing to meet their protein needs, and some of those different things. And that's kind of like something that a lot of times like they don't necessarily assess. And that's why you need to find somebody, a professional that can kind of like evaluate and assess those things so you can figure out, okay, you know what? Like, yes, you're a great candidate for something like this if you want to try it out, or no, like
You're not.
you barely consume 200 calories per meal because you feel too full. So why
Hmm.
would we want to do this? So those are like things that, a lot of times like it's just very individualized. So not, one size does not fit all for everybody.
Yeah. So, two as one goal is asking, is there an amount of fat you need to eat if you're doing IF?
It depends. So this really comes down to again like the type of program that you're following. I will tell you though, like again, back to that caloric restriction, when some people like especially women are way too low in calories and their fat starts to go below like 35 to 30 grams on a daily basis, then naturally you're going to start to see some issues as far as like hormones, because like fat is important for hormonal adaptations and for hormonal changes in the body. Not necessarily like super high fat depending on the program that you're following, but not necessarily either like, very low fat. So a lot of times simply because of the caloric restriction that some people create as a result of fasting, their fat levels go below
Yeah.
40, 35, which for me, I would never recommend something like that.
Yeah, I think fat's the easiest one to go, the easiest macronutrient to go because it is the most calorically dense. And,
Yeah.
you know, for someone, if you're on like a 1,500 calorie diet, let's say, to start, you know, eating peanut butter, you don't have a ton of room for that. So it's one of those things that, you know, you can have 200 calories of peanut butter, or you can have like grilled chicken, a piece of sweet potato, and broccoli. So the fat tends to go first, but that's also where you start to see a lot of those negative consequences. Yeah,
Correct.
I never drop people that low. I'm also
Yeah.
not like a very high fat, tend
Yeah.
to do like moderate fat, but to give like a range, if you're on a regular balanced diet,
Yeah.
like between 25 to 30% of your
I would
calories.
say so. That's
Mhm.
kind of like the place that I put it. And a regular type of like, program as far as like, moderate carbohydrates, moderate to depending on the person. Let's say this is just an average, workout
Yep.
doer, like 1 hour of training, cycling, CrossFit or something like that. And they're not necessarily like a super advanced athlete. Like usually about 25 to 30% of like, total calorie intake is usually more than enough. Or and that would equate for somebody, if you want to like specific number, to say somebody's a 2,000 calorie diet, that may be closer to like 60 to 65 to 70 grams of fat. While somebody, let's say a female is in 1,600 calories per day, it could be closer to like maybe 50 grams or something like that. So you have an idea, and I think you and I practice pretty similarly, so it's probably going to be somewhere along those lines.
Yeah. And most of my clients, when I first give them like their macros, if they see like 1,600 calories and they say, I will gain weight, I can't eat that. Or I can't eat 60 grams of fat, or I can't do this, I can't do that. So I think a lot of people here too are used to, like, they hear that number and it sounds crazy.
Yeah, and that's because again, like a lot of times it's either like lack of awareness of really how much you're really consuming, or a lot of times it's simply because of the fact that you don't understand that the fact that you're just not consuming enough calories is leading to that resistance that you're currently on. And this is again the biggest issue with intermittent fasting, and why I would not recommend it if you've never actually done something long enough or done it properly. Like, why would you even want to go through this route again? Because it's not necessarily going to be an effective strategy to be able to get you. It may be something short term to get you to your goals, because of the fact that again you're cutting out more calories, your body's like reacting because again it's
Right.
something new, just like any detox BS or any kind of diet that you're doing. Like, it's something new, you're cutting out calories abruptly and you're going to see the changes. And again, magically now your intermittent fasting is like, the whatever worked out for you. And again, it's a lot of times it's because like this quick burst of like shocks that you give to your body because you changed something that you were not doing before.
Hmm.
So that's
Yeah.
kind of like a weird way to present it and
Yeah.
put it.
So I would say definitely take away, if you have never tracked calories or macros before, I would definitely recommend you do that for a good period of time before you start exploring these other options.
Yeah, and I think that's probably going to be like the most important. And I think from to finish up on this specific topic on intermittent fasting is, you know, fasting is something that needs to be respected. Like, and I have personally implemented, and not that I would ever recommend this to anybody, but personally implemented because it's a way to understand exactly what happens to the body, to the human body, certain stages. Because we haven't even talked about the stages of fasting, of true fasting. But where somebody like human bodies can sustain living for like 20 to 30 days with proper hydration, but with lack of food. So the bodies are really amazing machines to be able to adapt to certain circumstances, but not in those circumstances. If you were stranded on an island, God forbid, and like you were giving drinkable water, you will be able, but no food at all for like 20 days, like 25 days, you will be able to survive. But then again, it's like the context in which this kind of stuff
Right.
exists on.
And
And
things
that's
start
why,
to shut down.
yeah,
Maybe your hair's falling out because you don't really need a hair if you're starving to death.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, so those are things like to consider. But then for people considering or saying like, "Hey, I would like to try intermittent fasting because I just want to do something different." If the goal is not like super dramatically saying like it's fat loss, and you do have a good nutritional foundation, then sure, like this is something that I would recommend you either get a nutrition coach that knows about this stuff, or a dietitian that can kind of coach you through the process. Now, if you're like, no, I want to like find that this is the next big thing for fat loss that I heard I need to be doing, no, let's go for this do something a little bit different. And I think that's kind of like the main takeaway that I think people listening to this, and they need to take, they need to take into consideration for their nutrition before they even consider starting something like this.
Yeah. And I think that's why like we're all very vocal about like diet trends and fads. And I think intermittent fasting is very different than that, because it isn't prescribing one way of eating. It is really looking at a schedule of eating. It's maybe like,
yes,
a different approach to the idea that breakfast is the most important meal of the day and all these things, where we're looking at maybe there's a better way.
Yeah.
Or maybe there's an easier way for some people.
And I got that you mentioned that, because again, intermittent fasting is something like, if you do implement it to your lifestyle, like a time restricted feeding schedule, like if you're vegan, sure, you can do intermittent fasting. Mm-hmm. If you are doing Whole30 because you want to try that out, sure, you can do that. You do a ketogenic diet, sure, you can do that. That's why I tell people it's not a diet, because you can technically implement it to any diet. Mm-hmm. So it's like restriction on the timing as far as like food intake. Yeah. You know what? A lot of times, what I personally implement, like, the intermittent fasting, as a practical application to people listening in, when it's well controlled, especially to some of my clients, and I say, I'm having this like really large like multi-course dinner. I know it's going to be crazy amount of calories I'm going to be consuming tonight. Is there anything that I can do to kind of like detox or anything like that? It's like, no. You know what? If you want to control calories and you want to like, again, this is a once in a lifetime type of thing that may happen. You know what? Let's try to skip breakfast like this day. Again, this is under control environments, because a lot of times when you tell people skip breakfast, then they just kind of like overdo it, like on purposely, the rest of the day, and it just kind of creates a really bad balance. But then whenever it's something controlled and well formulated, I say, you know what, today, let's just try to like, teach you how to like maybe push your meals a little bit later on. Try to like, maybe stay hydrated and doing different things like that. So you don't necessarily have to like completely be way off as far as like your calorie targets that we establish for ourselves by having this specific meal. Oh, okay, that makes sense. And a lot of times that works out really well for some people. Yeah. That's something personally that I, implement for myself as well.
Yeah. Caitlin, hi. So she answered Leanna's question. Do you recommend a certain daily calorie amount for women for weight and fat loss?
Yeah.
And Caitlin's 100% right there. It is so individual. It depends on.
Yeah, it depends on where you're starting.
It depends on where you're starting. Even if we didn't even look at a formula, height, weight, age, gender, activity level, what your current diet is like. I think the best advice I could give to someone outside of working with someone one-on-one is to track what you're doing, track your results and your metrics, and do it for a long enough period of time, as objectively as possible. So even the things you don't want to track, and see where you're at. If you're maintaining, then your calories are at maintenance. If you're losing, then you're eating in a calorie deficit. If you're gaining, then you're eating in a surplus.
Yeah, some people ask in there, like, is there a formula you both recommend? Like, there's not. Like, I mean, I can tell you, like, just when I teach, I'm going to do workshops just for people who have, like, a basic idea, like, like a quick idea in their head. Again, this is, like, don't quote me on this, but I usually kind of say, you know what, like, if you want to have, like, some sort of, like, you're a person that is active, that, maybe work in an office, but then you get some steps in on a daily basis, something like that. If you take your weight, and you really wanted a number, and you multiply it by anywhere between 12 to 14, it's going to give you some sort of like ballpark as far as like maintenance calories. And maintenance calories is the amount of calories your body requires for just like stay where it's at. Now, when I say this, I'm not saying like, oh, like this guy said that I need to be consuming 12 to 14 of this. No, it may be higher, it may be lower.
It's a starting point.
But it's a starting point. So you have some sort of like idea as far as like where you need to be. And women listening to this are going to be like, and then they're going to do the math. I'm going to be like, holy crap, 2,000 calories. It's like, and yes, that is correct. And then you may be consuming right now 1,000. And maybe if you're doing intermittent fasting, that actually brings it down. Or let's say like 1,300. Now intermittent fasting is going to bring it out to 1,000. Your body doesn't like that kind of stress that you're putting it under.
Yeah,
and for that period of time, it's not going to be ideal. So, and that's when we get into like, advanced stuff like reverse dieting and stuff like that we don't really have enough time to talk about today. But yes, that's a good start. Starting point.
Yeah, so what I'm sure what we both do is we have formulas, I use them, but I also need to like really dive into what your past history is, what you're currently
Yeah.
doing. Have you keep a journal even before we meet for the first time so that I can see what like a good and bad day looks like? Because I'm not going to take someone who's at 1,000 calories and tell them to eat 2,000. I'm going to give them like the picture of where we need to get to and kind of work them up slowly. So I think like the best thing that anyone could do who's unsure of how much they should be eating is really look at what are you currently eating?
Yeah.
And
That's
what
the big
kind of
thing.
results are you seeing or not seeing?
Creating awareness around that, and then follow like, you know, the consistency path, not the perfecting one. So that's what I teach every single person, and I think that's like that's the path to be able to achieve goals, especially when you feel like, you know, you're kind of stuck in some place. A lot of times it's just a lack of consistency, and that's a part of it that I feel like it's important to so people like listening to this to understand that it's not intermittent fasting. It's not, you know, Whole30 or detox or all these kind of things like that that are going to give you that kind of magical solution. But like the awareness that you create around your nutrition and kind of comparing yourself to yourself as far as progression and how long can you actually maintain this and be consistent with it to be able to understand what's happening. So that's kind of like the main thing from this. So
Yeah, absolutely.
awesome. Anything?
So
I don't think
any
there's any more questions. Any
any
more
other
questions?
questions that we didn't get to? Let me see. We talked
I
about,
guess like I think it's like we can briefly talk about autophagy and like longevity. Like we can kind of finish up
mhm.
with that. Like another big claim that happens in intermittent fasting that a lot of people talk about, which is going to be autophagy is essentially like the self-recycling process of your cells.
Like
It's essentially
self-cleaning
like
kind of.
the self-cleaning is essentially when there's like bad cells in your body, like, you know, there's like a
Like
sensing
a
system.
janitor that
Yeah, there's a janitor that comes
keeps
in and
out
says
all the
like, oh,
cells.
yeah, the cells are bad. Let's just kind of like eat them up, or like let's just like take care of them and this, you know, like eliminate them. Autophagy is something that happens every single day in your life cycle. Now, supposedly, as we age, obviously that like the autophagy process actually not it starts to kind of like fail a little bit more, and that's why obviously there's, you know, some issues with chronic diseases and stuff like this. So supposedly fasting, it's a process in which it's enhancing or optimizing autophagy, which is again that body's ability to self-cleansing, to clean itself from like bad cells. The thing about it is most of the research done in autophagy comes from animals. So essentially they take either rats or monkeys and they look to see what happens in their lifespan, which in a rat is like 40 days, and then they intermittent fasting for 40 days. And then they realized that the rats that the intermittent fasting for, you know, 40 days versus the ones that didn't, they lived a little bit longer. They lived 45 days instead of 40. So from that data, they extrapolate that, well, technically humans then, if they live 80 years, means like if you do intermittent fast every single day, you're going to live until you're 85. It doesn't apply. It's, you know, animal studies don't always replicate into humans, and so it's really difficult to kind of establish that. But here's the thing. A lot of the studies have shown this also in caloric restriction. When you create caloric restriction every so often during the year, you can also get the same results from autophagy. So it's a very like new type of like topic. It's a new, like, there's a lot of still the research that it's not effective. And the main reason is because you can't conduct a study from the moment that somebody's born until the moment that they die, and then intermittent fasting for that perspective. So Tony's
Yeah.
here. What's
Hi,
up, Tony?
Tony.
So yeah, that's like a big thing as far as longevity and autophagy from that perspective.
Yeah. How much protein would you recommend for someone who's working out 10 hours a week and looking to gain muscle?
10 hours a week, that's
That's a
probably
lot.
about, it's like 2 hours a day. You're doing 5 days, you know, or 6 days. For I think that's Sarah. Okay, female. It depends. Like I think for especially for like getting muscle, it's not necessarily adding more protein. I think a lot of times you
More
manipulate that
calories,
more
yeah.
calories. Like so, a lot of times it's like more up in your carbs and in kind of equal amounts. Sometimes like, you know, increasing a little bit more of your fat. But usually for most people, I recommend it between 1.8 to 2.2 grams per kilogram, which that may be anywhere between
Yeah,
1
like
to
1 gram per
1.2.
pound-ish.
Yeah. To 1 to 1.2 grams per pound of body weight. I
Yeah.
think that's a good starting line. But again, this is considering that maybe you're a lean individual already. There's so many different things that come into play, but that's a good
Yeah.
starting point. hmm
hmm
Why did you stop feeling hungry after fasting for a period of time? Great. We didn't get to this, but this is actually something related with hormone,
Ghrelin and leptin.
yeah, ghrelin and leptin. So like the hunger and satiety hormones. And a lot of times, simply your body kind of change the secretion at certain times. And again, back to this, the biological clock, and it happens to this. Now, in some cases, this also may be reflected by the fact that maybe you're restricting calories way too much. And sometimes like that can kind of create some sort of like resistance. And I see this in a lot of women, for example, that are consuming 1,000 calories, like, oh, I can't really eat more. Again, this goes two ways. Either they're just binging other times of the day or eating way too much, or in some cases, they literally don't have an appetite because there's like, their hormones, specifically ghrelin and leptin, are a little off track. So that's something that I've seen in the past.
Yeah. And then, so calculate the amount of calories again is a quick and dirty little estimation. Your maintenance calories are somewhere between your body weight times 12 to 14.
Yeah.
So a deficit would be below that.
Yeah, that's a good point to kind of start like, looking at it.
Yeah. Or if you wanted to, you could Google TDEE calculator, and that's your total daily energy expenditure. That'll give you your maintenance calories, and you could subtract a couple hundred calories from there and start experimenting. Yep,
that's a good way to do it.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, for people, if there's like, people listening to this, I did create a intermittent fasting course guide. It's like a free thing
I'll
that
post that to my stories.
Yeah, that you can get from like my website, and literally all you do is like you get like 4 or 5 different videos. I break down like what is it, the types, how to essentially kind of estimate needs based on intermittent fasting methods, and how to formulate it well, and the typical common, frequently asked questions, which we cover a lot of them here today. So if, you want to kind of share that with your audience, if they want to get some of that information.
I'll post a link to that so they can download.
Awesome.
That's awesome. That's such a great resource.
Yeah. So this has been fun.
I know.
I think we covered pretty much everything.
So
of course,
too.
If there's anything that you can do, like any other questions that kind of come up, let me know. And anybody listening to this, obviously, if you want to have any questions, feel free to shoot me a message.
Yeah. Awesome. And I will see you this weekend at Fancy.
Fancy, yes, that's exciting. We'll see you there, and we'll keep chatting about this and other topics for sure.
Exactly. Thanks so much, Andres. This was awesome.
Bye, Alex. Take care.
Bye.
See ya.